Good morning. I'm so glad you could join me today as we look at God's Word together in the Unfolding the Word series. We're in the midst of Daniel. We're now in Daniel chapter 6, that famous episode of Daniel in the lion's den. I want to pick up our reading today in chapter 6, beginning in verse 16. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. And the king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace, and he spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled away from him. And then at the break of the day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And as he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Now you remember the context here. The Medo-Persian Empire has now taken over. The Babylonian Empire is finished. The particular ruler over the former province of Babylon is Darius, put in that position by Cyrus, the emperor of the Medo-Persian Empire. Darius, who had a care for Daniel, protected him in the destruction of Babylon, and actually put him in leadership in the new province. Daniel's performance was so exemplary that he was going to move Daniel into the number 2 position. And at that point in time, the other leaders in jealousy began to plot Daniel's downfall. They could find nothing in Daniel's life that would legitimately be able to assassinate his character. So they decided, listen, it's going to be in his belief system that we have to find something. There were no laws that currently conflicted with Daniel's beliefs, an interesting point that I made with you before. So they created one and tricked the king into establishing it. The forbidding of any prayer, open prayer, for 30 days. Well, Daniel continued on in open defiance of that because he had a higher law, a higher king that he was serving, and that required a continuing overt commitment to that king, not just a privatized faith. Well, the enemies gathered that evidence, brought it to the king, and in their plot, forced the king's hand to indict him. Darius cared for Daniel. He wanted to deliver Daniel, but his hands were tied now, and he spent a day trying to figure a way to accomplish it, and he could find no solution. Medo-Persian law required that if a death penalty situation was proven, it had to be done within that day. And so the day ends, and he has to reluctantly send Daniel to the lion's den. But even as he did that, he hoped for a miracle. Now, let's get into our verses today. That was a quick summary of where we've been. The king, having assigned Daniel now to the lion's den for capital punishment, had to ensure that there was no escape possible for Daniel from the death penalty itself. He would have had to do that for anybody who was put into the lion's den. So he did that in several ways. Number one, he put a great rock over the mouth of the cave that led to the pit. And remember, I talked to you about the lion's den, a deeper pit divided into 2 sections. There would have had to have been a ramp of some sort, like a cave, going down to the bottom of the pit. That was where he forced Daniel into, covered over that ramp area, covered it over, and sealed the rock that had been put there so that it couldn't be moved, the seal couldn't be broken. That reminds me, by the way, of Pilate's efforts with the tomb that Jesus was put into, rolling a stone in front of it, putting a seal on it to try to prevent anybody from messing with the body. Well, as in the case of Jesus at the resurrection, so in the case here with Daniel, no seal from any human being can disrupt the plans of God. He'll do what he wants to do. And in fact, that is what we see happened. Implied here, it doesn't say it, but because of the nature of the death sentence in the lion's den, this cage or set of bars separating the two segments of the pit would have had to also been removed. So once Daniel was put in, the hungry lions, starved lions essentially, would have been given access to Daniel. So the king was pretty thorough in fulfilling the law and making sure that nothing could contest and disrupt this death sentence for Daniel. Nothing short of the God of the Scriptures intervening. Well, at any rate, that's where we find ourselves. After having done that, which remember, Darius did reluctantly, he only did because his hands were tied. He'd been tricked by those other leaders. He then leaves the situation. He doesn't stay to see, well, what's going to happen to Daniel. He leaves, returns to his palace, and spent a sleepless night. He cared about Daniel. God had given him a care for the prophet Daniel, a miracle of God, I believe. And he was trapped into punishing the one he cared about. Can you imagine the grief and the frustration that was going on in Darius? His distress over the situation kept him up all night. He had no sleep, no, quote, enjoyment, things that would have been part of his right now as the king over that Babylonian province. It also says not only that he did that, but he spent the night fasting. Praying and fasting is the idea here. Now, I want to ask you a question. Who was Darius fasting to? During that night, that sleepless night, as the man he cared about was now being killed, seemingly, because his hand was forced and he had to actually order it. Who was he fasting to? This action of self-denial, of fasting, designed to humble someone, to seek help from a higher God. Who was he fasting to? And I think if you look at the passage, there's no answer to that short of saying he was fasting and seeking to speak to the God of Daniel. He was the one who he, in assigning Daniel to the pit, believed would have to intervene. And that's the one he wanted to intervene. So who would he ask to intervene? God. That's who. An interesting thing happening in Darius's heart that we're going to come to see reveals something very significant about God's working in Darius, this secular king. We've seen God already working in the secular king in the various ways in Nebuchadnezzar's life. Now we're going to see it in Darius's life. Well, the night dragged on, fasting, petition to God, prayer. Dawn comes. And with the breaking of dawn, Darius, it says here, rushed to the lion's den. He just had to see how the night turned out, how this death sentence resolved itself. And before he gets there, but within earshot of it, so that whoever was in the pit and those surrounding the pit, because I suspect there were others watching throughout the night, wanting to see the death of this hated Daniel, as he gets there, before he actually can see what's happened, he cries out to Daniel. And what is it he cries out? Has your God been able to deliver you? Isn't that interesting? In other words, what I've been fasting over and praying for all night long, has your God been doing this? Has he helped you? He was hoping against all hope that this would have happened. And yet I want you to understand something. As he's coming within earshot, but not visually connecting yet to what's happened in the lion's den, he's calling out to Daniel. It implies that at some level, he was assuming there was still somebody there that could answer him. Faith building incrementally in the life of Darius, the king, under this oversight of Cyrus, emperor of the Medo-Persian Empire. We also learn in these verses one final point. The king knew Daniel, and he knew Daniel continually served his God. In verse 16, he says, "May your God whom you serve continually." Verse 20, "May your God whom you serve continually." He knew that about Daniel. I want to ask you today, do people know that about you? Do they know that you love the Lord, that you serve him continually with your life, that he's number one, and that you will serve him at whatever cost? Do they know that about you the way they knew that about Daniel? Oh, may it be so. May it be so. What a wonderful goal that would be. Well, let's continue our story tomorrow. Join me as we see how God's deliverance was manifested. God bless.